The harsh Wyoming winter of 1887 showed no mercy to those cast aside. In the forgotten edges of Cottonwood Springs, Eleanor Finch sat alone in her weathered cabin, the wheels of her chair frozen in place like her heart. 36 years old, overweight and paralyzed from the waist down after a stage accident, she had become invisible to a town that once knew her name. Outside, as snow painted the landscape white, a lone figure approached. Narco, an Apache warrior, whose tribe no longer claimed him, whose body bore the scars of 100 rejections. He carried nothing but a small bundle and eyes that had seen too much cruelty. What happens when two souls rejected by everyone find refuge in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor's cabin consisted of one main room with a small bedroom partitioned off to the side. Everything essential had been lowered or modified after the accident. Hooks on the walls, shelves within reach, counters a careful height, a place designed for her limitations, yet a constant reminder of them. 6 years, she muttered, her breath fogging the glass. 6 years since the stagecoach's wheel had caught that rock. 6 years since she'd woken up in Doc Miller's house with legs that wouldn't move. 6 years of watching Cottonwood Springs continue without. Eleanor's reflection stared back, a woman of 36 whose face had aged beyond her years. Her once bright auburn hair hung limply around full cheeks. She turned away, unwilling to catalogue the changes. The last visitor had been 3 weeks ago, Miss Palmer, dropping off supplies with a smile that never reached her eyes. Such a shame, she'd overheard Mrs. Palmer tell her husband once. She was such a lovely thing before. Now look at her, can't walk, put on all that weight. No wonder she hides away. Eleanor reached for the crocheted blanket on her lap. Her grandmother's pattern, her fingers at least, remained nimble. The blanket was one of dozens she'd made with no one to give them to. The fire needed tending. She maneuvered toward the hearth, the wheels catching on an uneven floorboard. The familiar jolt sent pain up her spine. With practiced movements, she used the iron poker to shift the logs, watching sparks ascend. Before the accident, Eleanor had taught at the town school. She'd had suitors, invitations. Perp Frederick Holloway had even proposed his mother's ring, offered on a spring afternoon. 2 months later, he'd stood awkwardly by her bedside, unable to meet her eyes, as he explained how he couldn't possibly, and surely she understood. She understood. All right, she understood every time the townspeople's voices shifted to that particular tone, gentle but distant, as if her paralysis might be catching. She understood when conversation stopped, as she wheeled past the general store, when mothers pulled curious children away. The lonely hours had taught Eleanor efficiency. She prepared a simple supper, beans and cornbread, positioning ingredients within reach on her lap table. The ritual was precise: measure, mix, reach, stir. The trick was planning every movement to minimize effort. As darkness fell, she lit the oil lamp and positioned her chair by the window again. The silhouette of the man, the Apache, was still visible at the edge of her property. He hadn't moved closer, but he hadn't left either. Eleanor's hand moved to the drawer where she kept her father's revolver. She'd never fired it, but its presence offered comfort on nights when the wind howled too fiercely or unknown sounds penetrated the darkness. What did he want? The town had made its feelings about Indians clear enough. Most were gone now, driven further west or north. This one looked half frozen, his frame too thin even beneath winter clothing. Not my concern, she thought firmly. The world had taught Eleanor that kindness was for the fortunate, for those with something to spare. She had nothing, not even hope to share. As night deepened, snow accumulated on her windowsill in delicate layers. Tomorrow would bring more of the same. Eleanor's world had contracted to these walls, these routines, this solitude. The stranger shifted, hunching against the growing storm. Eleanor turned away from the window. Tomorrow he would be gone, moved on to seek shelter elsewhere. Everyone left eventually. She extinguished the lamp and wheeled herself to bed, the transfer from chair to mattress a practiced choreography. In darkness she arranged her useless legs beneath the quilt and closed her eyes, trying to ignore the howling wind and the knowledge that someone stood in it, watching her sanctuary with unknown intent. His fingers, numb, despite the rabbit fur gloves, clutched the small bundle of possessions that remained to him. Everything he owned in this world wrapped in a trade blanket: tools, medicines, memories. The white settlement of Cottonwood Springs lay a mile east. He had tried there first, offering to chop wood, tend horses, anything for a corner to sleep in out of the killing cold. The shopkeeper had spat at his feet. The livery stable owner had reached for his shotgun. The saloon had erupted in laughter at his request for work. "We don't need your kind here," the sheriff had said, hand resting meaningfully on his holster. "Keep moving." So Narco had kept moving, as he had for 2 winters now, since the day Standing Elk had proclaimed before the entire tribe that Narco's ideas of peace with the white settlers made him neither Apache nor man. Since his mother's people had rejected him for being too white in his thinking, while the white world rejected him for the copper of his skin. The woman in the cabin, he had seen her briefly when she came to the window, alone, her face lined with something he recognized: pain, solitude, the weight of others' judgment. He shifted, wincing as the cold had stiffened the old wound in his leg. The cavalry soldier's bullet had shattered bone 2 summers ago, leaving him with a permanent limp. Another mark against him in a world where weakness invited predators. Narco's stomach cramped with hunger. 3 days since his last meal, half a rabbit snared in the foothills. The approaching storm had driven game deep into hiding. He had followed the creek until it led him here, hoping to find a trapper's cabin or hunting lodge. Instead, he found her, a woman in a wheeled chair, watching him with the same weariness he had learned to wear like a second skin. Snow began falling more heavily, blanketing his shoulders. If he stayed here through the night, he would not see morning. The decision formed slowly: approach the cabin, offer what he could in exchange for shelter. The worst she could do was what everyone else had done: turn him away or shoot him. He had survived worse. Narco straightened, gathering his dignity. His father had been a healer among the people, respected and sought after. Before the sickness took him, he had taught Narco which plants drew poison from wounds, which bark eased pain, which roots broke fever. Knowledge that had kept Narco alive, even when he wished otherwise. His hand went to the small knife at his belt, ironwood handle worn smooth by his father's hand, then his own. He'd carved his story into the bottom of the handle. Not in words, but in symbols only he could read. Each rejection, each kindness. The balance heavily weighted to one side. As Narco approached the cabin, memories of his grandmother surfaced unbidden. She had been the one to teach him English, having learned it from the mission school. "Knowledge is a weapon they cannot take from you," she had told him. "Learn their words, learn their ways, but never forget who you are." Who was he now? Neither fully Apache nor accepted by whites. A man between worlds, belonging to neither. The snow thickened, curtain the landscape in white. The woman's cabin stood as the only point of light in a darkening world. Narco's path had led him here, to this moment, to this door, to the simple, desperate human need for warmth and shelter. He had nothing to offer but his hands, his knowledge, his willingness to work. It had not been enough for the townsfolk. It had not been enough for his tribe. Perhaps it would not be enough for her either. But the alternative was a cold death under indifferent stars. And despite everything, Narco was not ready to surrender his breath to the winter. Not yet. He took a step forward, then another. The snow erased his footprints almost as quickly as he made them. No way back, only forward. The story of his life in a trail of disappearing steps. The cabin door loomed before him now. Beyond it, a woman who might turn him away like all the others, or who might, by some miracle, see in him what others had refused to see. A human being, seeking only to survive another day, who's there, her voice cracked from disuse, Silence answered. Then, man seeking shelter versus storm. The words were carefully formed. The accent unfamiliar. Eleanor's throat tightened. The Indian. She glanced at the rifle above the door, out of her reach by design. What fool hangs protection where the vulnerable can't grasp it? I have nothing for you, she called. Town's that way. She pointed east, though he couldn't see the gesture. Town not welcome me. His voice sounded weary rather than threatening. Storm getting worse. I trade work for corner to sleep. Eleanor wheeled closer to the door, pressing her ear against the rough wood. What kind of work? Chop wood. Fix things. No medicine for pain. Her back spasmed as if on cue, the familiar agony that kept her awake most nights. Eleanor hesitated, years of warnings about savages warring with the simple fact that she hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks. You're the one who's been watching my cabin. Yes, no excuses, no denial. Why? A pause, deciding if you shoot me if I ask for help. The honesty startled a bitter laugh from her. I might still, then I die warm instead of cold. Better way, snow whispered against the windows, the wind's howl rising to a scream. Eleanor closed her eye. The sensible choice was to send him away. The human choice might be different. Step back from the door, she ordered. Way back. She heard the crunch of snow as he complied. Eleanor unlatched the door, using the handle to pull her chair back as it swung open. The cold struck her first, then the sight of him tall and gaunt, snow crusting his dark hair and the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His face was all angles, high cheekbones and deep-set eyes that assessed her with equal weariness. You alone? He said, not a question. Yes, and I want to stay that way. Her hand moved to the drawer where her father's revolver lay. He nodded once. Understanding. I sleep in woodshed. Fix broken step tomorrow. Cut wood. Then go. The practicality of the offer gave her pause. The woodshed was separate from the cabin. The step had been rotting for months, and the woodpile was dangerously low. You have a name? She asked. Nako. Eleanor Finch. The formality felt strange, like hosting a tea party on the edge of a cliff. The woodshed isn't insulated. He shrugged. Better than snow. Eleanor studied him. No weapons visible except a knife at his belt. Eyes clear, not clouded with drink. A straight-backed dignity despite his obvious exhaustion. One night, she said finally, the shed has extra blankets in the trunk. There's jerky in the blue jar. Take 3 pieces, no more. Relief flickered across his face, quickly controlled. Thank you. Eleanor began to close the door, then paused. Why come to me? A woman alone is usually the last door a strange man approaches in a storm. Nako considered her question. Snowflakes melting on his eyelashes. Saw you in window. Thought maybe you know. Know what? How it feels when people look through you instead of at you. The words struck with physical force. Eleanor's hand tightened on the door frame. This man had seen straight through to the core of her isolation. With one glance, the woodshed lock goes on, she said, her voice rougher than intended. First sign of trouble, I fire the rifle. I won't miss. He nodded once. Fair terms. Eleanor closed the door, throwing the bolt with trembling fingers. Through the window, she watched his limping figure make its way to the woodshed, disappearing inside without a backward glance. She sat motionless in her chair, listening to the storm's fury and the hammering of her own heart. For the first time in years, another human being slept on her property, a stranger, an Indian, a man who had recognized her invisibility because he wore the they cloak. Sleep would not come easily tonight. She performed her morning routine with practiced efficiency, washing, dressing, the careful transfer from bed to chair, each movement a silent victory over her body's limitations. Through the window, she could see no tracks in the pristine snow. Had he left during the night? The thought brought a confusing mixture of relief and disappointment. The cabin's chill prompted her toward the stove. She reached for kindling. A knock sounded. Not at the door this time, but at the window. Eleanor startled, nearly toppling a stack of books. Nako stood outside, arms full of split wood. His breath fogged the glass as he nodded toward the door. Eleanor hesitated, then wheeled over to unlock it. "Morning," he said, entering just far enough to place the wood beside the stove. Snow melted from his hair onto shoulders already damp from exertion. "You've been busy," she observed, noting the cleared path from woodshed to cabin. "Path for wheels," he said simply, gesturing at her chair. "Steps next." Eleanor watched him retreat outside, conflicted. His presence was an intrusion, yet the woodbox was filled, the path cleared, small things that would have taken her days to manage, if at all. From her window, she observed his methodical work on the broken step. His movements were precise despite the obvious stiffness in his right leg. A man accustomed to working through pain, she recognized the signs all too well. Near midday, Eleanor found herself heating water, placing her mother's teacup and a chipped mug on her lap tray. She rolled to the door, opening it as Nako hammered the last nail into the repaired step. "Tea," she said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "If you want it." He studied her face, perhaps searching for mockery or tricks. Finding none, he nodded, carefully wiping his hands on his worn trousers before accepting the mug. They drank in silence, steam rising between them like unspoken questions. Eleanor noticed a deep scar running from his temple into his hairline, another across his knuckles. A history of violence etched into flesh. "Where did you learn carpentry?" she asked finally. "Mission school, 2 years before I ran away." His English flowed more freely now, accent still present, but words clearly chosen. "They thought trades would civilize us. Did it work?" The question escaped before she could reconsider its bluntness. Something like amusement flickered in his dark eyes. "I can fix steps. Still not welcome in town. You decide." Eleanor found herself almost smiling, the sensation so unfamiliar it almost hurt. "Fair point." Nako glanced at the sky, calculating. "More snow coming tonight. Need more wood." The practicality of their exchange was oddly comforting. No pitying glances at her chair, no awkward avoidance of her condition. Just the simple mathematics of survival. Work exchanged for shelter, tasks identified and completed. "There's stew," she said, surprising herself again. "After the wood." He nodded once, returning the empty mug. Their fingers did not touch in the exchange, a careful distance maintained by mutual unspoken agreement. As he turned to resume his work, Eleanor spoke again. "The woodshed, it's no place for a person in this cold." Nako paused, waiting. "There's floor space by the stove. I'll put down blankets." She tightened her grip on the wheels of her chair. "Door stays locked between us at night." "I keep the pistol at hand." He turned, studying her with those unfathomable eyes. "Why offer?" The question hung between them. Why indeed? Eleanor hardly knew herself. "Because the alternative would be cruel," she said finally. "And I've had enough of cruelty to last a lifetime." Understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared experience without need for elaboration. "I'll bring more wood," he said simply. Eleanor nodded, closing the door as he returned to his task. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed her mother's teacup back on its shelf, the last remnant of a genteel life long vanished. She had invited a stranger into her sanctuary, a man about whom she knew nothing except that he too understood what it meant to be cast aside. It was madness, perhaps, or perhaps it was the first truly human thing she'd done in years. The fourth morning brought a change. Eleanor emerged to find Nako studying her kitchen shelves, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Problem?" she asked, wheeling to her usual breakfast spot. He turned, seeming unsurprised by her silent approach. "Things too high, hard for you to reach." Eleanor felt her face tighten. 6 years of adaptations, and still half her possessions remained accessible only on good days when pain didn't limit her stretching. Could manage better." He gestured toward the upper shelves. "I lower these, make new ones at right height." The offer hovered between them. Eleanor had grown accustomed to difficulty, to the daily strain of reaching beyond comfort. The prospect of ease felt almost like cheating. Why? She asked, bluntly. Nako considered her question, his expression thoughtful. Need occupation. You need help. Simple trade. And when you leave, the question emerged sharper than intended. Shelves, stay. His mouth quirked slightly, not quite a smile but close. Like step, like path. Eleanor studied him. In just days, his face had become familiar. The strong line of his jaw, the slight asymmetry of features that spoke of a broken nose long healed. His clothes remained worn, but were now clean, having been washed in the basin, while she pretended not to notice his careful preservation of dignity. Fine, she agreed finally. There's a toolbox under my bed. They established a rhythm that day. Eleanor cooked while Nako worked, the sound of his tools blending with the clock's steady ticking. Occasionally she would direct him, lower, to the left, not that jar, and he would adjust without comment. No wasted words between them, yet a strange harmony in their shared purpose. By midday the transformation was evident. Cooking utensils, preserved goods, medicinals, all now within comfortable reach of her seated position. Eleanor found herself completing tasks in minutes that had once taken painful quarters of an hour. "How did you know?" she asked, as they shared a simple meal of cornbread and bean. "The exact height, I mean." Nako set down his spoon. "Watched how you stretch, where it hurts, where it doesn't." His observation was matter of fact, without pity. Eleanor's instinct was to bristle at being studied, but the results spoke for themselves. "You're observant. Have to be. World dangerous for people like us." The statement hung in the air between them. People like us. The outcasts. The unwanted. "What happened to your leg?" Eleanor asked, the question escaping before propriety could contain it. Nako's hand moved unconsciously to his right thigh. "Cavalry 2 summers ago," said I. "Stall horse." "Didn't." His sentences grew more clipped. Memories clearly unwelcome. "Shot first?" asked later. "They're good at that," Eleanor said softly. "Shooting first." Something passed between them, a current of understanding that required no elaboration. "Your legs?" he asked, the question gentle despite its directness. "Stagecoach accident. Wheel broke on a boulder. We rolled down an embankment." Eleanor found herself speaking more freely than she had in years. "Woke up in the doctor's house. Everyone else walked away with scratches. I never walked again." Nako nodded, accepting her story without the usual awkward expressions of sympathy that made her teeth clench. "Good wheels," he said, glancing at her chair. "But heavy for your arms. Could make better." Eleanor laughed, despite herself. Rusty sound she barely recognized. "You planning to rebuild my entire life while you're here?" Nako's expression remained serious. "Just the parts that can be fixed." The simple statement settled around her like a blanket, warm and unexpectedly comforting. Neither of them mentioned his eventual departure again that day. As evening drew in, Eleanor found herself less eager for the solitude of her bedroom. They sat in companionable silence, she with her mending, he carving something small from a piece of kindling. The clock ticked steadily on the mantel, marking a day unlike any in her recent memory. Not quite friendship, not quite peace, but something like the beginning of both. "What's behind there?" Nako asked one evening, nodding toward a corner draped with an old quilt. Eleanor followed his gaze, something tightening in her chest. "Nothing important." He returned to the chair leg he was repairing, not pressing further. Eleanor wheeled herself to the window, watching twilight settle over the unbroken white landscape. The question nagged at her. Why hide it? What did it matter anymore? "It's a writing desk," she said finally, turning back to him, from before. Nako set down his tools, waiting. He had become adept at this, creating spaces of silence she felt compelled to fill. "I used to write, stories mostly. Some poems, foolish things." He rose and approached the quilt-covered shape, looking to her for permission. After a moment, she nodded. He carefully drew back the covering, revealing a small oak secretary desk, its surface thick with dust. "Not foolish," he said, running a finger through the dust, creating a clean line. "Words remain when people go." Eleanor moved closer, seeing the desk as if for the first time in years. The small drawers that had once held her papers, the inkwell, long dry, the place where she had once dreamed on paper. "I haven't written since the accident," she admitted. "Seemed pointless when no one would read it." "You would read it." Nako's logic was simple and direct. "Is that not enough?" The question struck her like a physical blow. When had she decided her words only mattered if others valued them? When had she surrendered that part of herself? "Perhaps," she conceded. Her hand reached out, fingertips brushing the dusty surface. "I'm not the person who sat here anymore." "No," Nako agreed. "That person didn't know pain, didn't know strength." He gestured to her chair. "This person knows both." Eleanor looked up sharply, searching his face for mockery or pity. She found neither, only a straightforward assessment that left no room for self-deception. "You think this is strength?" She gestured to her unmoving legs, her chair. "This prison?" "Yes." His certainty was unnerving. "Easy to die, hard to live when world says you shouldn't. Takes strength." A laugh escaped her, bitter and surprised. "Well, you're the first to see it that way." "Not first, just first to say it." He moved the desk slightly, positioning it where her chair could easily approach. Some truths people keep silent. The simple gesture, making space for her at her own desk, unlocked something Eleanor had kept carefully buried. Words began to form in her mind, pressing against her consciousness like water against a dam. "What do you write?" she asked, suddenly curious about this man who spoke little, but said much. Nako's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Stories of my people. In my head only. Not on paper." "Why not?" "Mission school beat children who spoke our language, beat harder for writing it." His jaw tightened momentarily, said our stories were devil worship. Eleanor's hands gripped her armrests. "That's barbaric." "Yes, a simple agreement with no self-pity." "So stories stay here." He tapped his temple. "Safe." An idea formed, tentative but insistent. "You could tell me one, I could write it down." Nako went very still, studying her with an intensity that might have been uncomfortable days earlier. Now Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Why would you do this?" he asked finally. "Because words remain when people go." She echoed his own wisdom back to him. "Your stories deserve to remain." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a tension releasing, not quite a smile, but the closest she had seen. "Perhaps," he said, using her own non-committal response. One day, they fell silent, the moment fragile between them. Eleanor realized with a start that the barrier between them had altered, not disappeared, but transformed into something permeable, something that allowed passage of thoughts, of stories, of truths. "I'll clean the desk tomorrow," she said, making a decision. "There should be fresh ink in the general store order coming next week." Nako nodded, returning to his repair work. But something had changed in the cabin's atmosphere, a current of possibility that had not existed before. That night, Eleanor dreamed of words flowing from her pen, like water after a long drought. Nako appeared from the woodshed, axe in hand. Their eyes met through the window, a silent question passing between them. "It's Sheriff Miller," Eleanor said after peering outside, "and Reverend Simmons." Nako's expression hardened. He set down the axe deliberately. "I'll go to woods until they leave." "No." The words surprised them both. Eleanor squared her shoulders. "This is my property." The crunch of boots on snow grew louder. Eleanor smoothed her hair, painfully aware of her worn dress, and the unfamiliar warmth in her cheeks from recent days spent in actual conversation, rather than solitude. The knock, when it came, was authoritative. Eleanor opened the door to find Sheriff Miller's weathered face, his grey mustache frosted with ice crystals. Behind him stood Reverend Simmons, Bible clutched to his chest, like a shield. "Miss Finch," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. His gaze moved past her, narrowing at the sight of Nako standing near the stove. "Heard you had company." "News travels fast for a town that rarely remembers I exist," Eleanor replied dryly. "Mrs. Palmer mentioned seeing smoke and track." The sheriff's hand rested casually on his holster, the silver star catching the light. "Thought we'd check on your welfare." As you can see, I'm quite well. Reverend Simmons cleared his throat. Miss Finch, surely you understand our concern. A woman in your condition. A what, Reverend? Eleanor's voice had developed an edge these past weeks, honed on honest conversation rather than blunted by isolation. The Reverend flushed. Well, with an Indian, there have been attacks on homesteads further north. Narco has been here 2 weeks. In that time, he's repaired my steps, chopped enough wood to last the winter, and modified my home to better accommodate my condition, as you put it. Eleanor's hand gripped her wheel rim until her knuckles whitened, which is more than anyone from town has offered in 6 years. Sheriff Miller's eyes hardened. Now see here, Eleanor, we've always checked on you. You've dropped off supplies and fled as quickly as possible, terrified that paralysis might be catching. The words flowed freely now, years of bitterness finding voice, or worse, that you might be expected to actually help. The sheriff removed his hat, a gesture of forced patience. Miss Finch, we're just doing our Christian duty to ensure your Christian duty. Eleanor laughed, the sound brittle. Where was Christian duty when Frederick broke our engagement the moment he learned I wouldn't walk again? Where was it when the school board replaced me without so much as a letter of regret? Narco remained perfectly still, his presence a steady counterpoint to her rising emotion. That's neither here nor there, the sheriff said, his tone hardening. The fact remains that harboring an Indian, particularly one unknown to us, raises questions about your judgment. My judgment is perfectly sound. It's my patience that's wearing thin. Reverend Simmons stepped forward, Bible held before him like a talisman. Eleanor, dear, we only want what's best for you. Perhaps you should consider returning to town where proper care. I don't need proper care. I need respect. Eleanor's chin lifted, and I've found more of that from Narco in 2 weeks than from Cottonwood Springs in 6 years. A tense silence fell. The sheriff's gaze shifted to Narco. You got papers? Any tribe registration? Before Narco could answer, Eleanor intervened. He's my guest on my property. Unless you have a warrant, Sheriff, I believe our conversation is concluded. Sheriff Miller's jaw tightened beneath his mustache. This isn't wise, Eleanor. People will talk. People always talk. I've stopped listening. She began closing the door. Good day, gentlemen. This isn't over, the sheriff warned, replacing his hat. For your own good, we'll be back. The door closed with a satisfying thud. Eleanor's heart pounded, her hands trembling with the aftermath of confrontation. They will make trouble, Narco said quietly. They always have. Eleanor turned her chair to face him, just usually not to my face. Their eyes met in shared understanding. Something had shifted, a line crossed that could not be uncrossed. In defending Narco, Eleanor had severed the last tenuous threads connecting her to Cottonwood Springs. Why? He asked simply. Eleanor considered the question, surprised by the certainty of her answer. Because you saw me when they never did. She tried to hide her discomfort, but Narco's observant eyes missed little. Pain is worse tonight, he stated, watching her shift restlessly in her chair. It's nothing, she replied automatically, the denial as reflexive as breathing. Just the usual. Narco regarded her for a long moment. May I help? Unless you can restore my spine, there's nothing to be done. The words came out harsher than intended, edged with the day's accumulated tension. Cannot fix broken spine, he acknowledged, but can ease muscles that fight against it. Eleanor hesitated. Dr. Miller's laudanum sat in her cabinet, barely touched. She hated how it clouded her mind, how it made the world swim at the edges. But tonight the pain clawed up her back with unusual ferocity. What would you do? She asked, finally. Medicine, from plants, and pressure on right places. He stood, moving to his bundle of possessions. Use these for my leg, for others in tribe. He returned with a small leather pouch, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. From it he withdrew several small packets wrapped in birch bark. Need hot water, he said, his manner shifting subtly. This was not the hesitant man who had appeared at her door. This was someone who knew his worth, his skill. Eleanor directed him to the kettle. curious despite her skepticism. As he worked, she observed his methodical movements, the careful measuring, the grinding of dried leaves in her mother's old mortar and pestle, the murmured words in his native tongue that accompanied each step. "What are you saying?" she asked, thanks to plants for giving medicine. His hands moved with practiced precision. "Old ways. My father taught." "Your father was a healer?" Nako nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Best medicine man in 3 tribes. People traveled many days to see him." The kettle whistled. He poured steaming water over the crushed herbs, releasing a pungent, earthy aroma that filled the cabin. "Drink this," he said, straining the liquid into a cup. "Willow bark for pain. Other things for muscles." Eleanor accepted the cup dubiously, inhaling the steam. "It smells like wet earth." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Medicine not supposed to taste good, just work." She sipped cautiously. The bitterness made her grimace, but she persisted, strangely unwilling to disappoint him. "Now turn chair," he instructed after she'd finished. "We'll press places that hold pain." Eleanor hesitated, vulnerability rising like a tide. No one had touched her with healing intent, since the doctor had pronounced her condition irreversible. Touch now was clinical at best, awkward at worst. "I don't know if we'll not hurt you," Nako said quietly. "We'll stop if you ask." Something in his tone, respectful yet confident, decided her. She turned her chair, presenting her back to him. "Tell me where pain starts," he said, hands hovering near but not touching. "Lower back, then up like fire under the skin." His hands descended, fingers finding the knotted muscles with unerring accuracy. Eleanor gasped at the initial pressure, then gradually relaxed as his thumbs worked methodically upward along her spine. "Breathe deep," he instructed. "Let air reach pain." She complied, surprised at how naturally she followed his guidance. His hands were strong but gentle, working with a healer's knowledge of the body's hidden architecture. "How did you learn this?" she asked, voice slightly muffled as tension began to release its grip. "Watching, doing." "My grandmother had gift for touch healing," said. "I inherited her hands." His fingers found a particularly tight knot, and Eleanor winced. "Sorry, this place holds much pain." 6 years' worth," she murmured. They fell silent, the only sounds the crack of the fire and Eleanor's occasional intake of breath. Gradually the pain receded like a tide, leaving exhaustion in its wake. "Better?" he asked eventually, stepping back. Eleanor straightened, taking inventory of her body. The pain hadn't vanished, but had subsided to a manageable ache rather than the searing agony of before. "Yes," she admitted, surprised. "Better than the doctor's medicines." Nako returned the mortar and pestle to her shelf, his movements deliberate. "Different knowledge. Not better, not worse, just different." Eleanor watched him, seeing beyond the exterior, the town feared to the healer underneath. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once, accepting her gratitude without elaboration. But something had changed between them. A trust offered and honored, a boundary crossed by mutual consent. That night, Eleanor slept without pain for the first time in years. "Won't be able to reach town today," Nako announced, returning from his morning check of the paths. Frost rimmed his dark hair, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Too cold. Dangerous." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "The scheduled supply delivery from Mrs. Palmer would have to wait. We have enough to manage. Flour's running low, but there's dried meat and preserves." They had settled into an arrangement that no longer required constant negotiation. Nako took on the outdoor tasks and repairs, while Eleanor managed the cooking and organization of their supplies. The division came naturally, based on ability rather than the conventions that might have governed them in another life. By midday, wind howled around the cabin's corners with renewed fury. Snow drove horizontally past the windows, erasing the world beyond. They were sealed in their sanctuary, cut off completely. "Worst storm yet," Eleanor observed, watching ice crystals form intricate patterns on the glass. Hope the roof holds. Narco glanced up at the ceiling beams. We'll check for leaks. Might need strengthening before next winter. Next winter. The words hung in the air, neither acknowledging the assumption they contained, that he might still be here, that this arrangement might extend beyond the immediate need for survival. Eleanor returned to her writing desk, where she had begun transcribing the stories Narco shared in the evenings. His initial reluctance had gradually yielded to a tentative willingness, then to an evident pleasure in seeing his oral traditions take written form. "Which one are you working on?" he asked, moving to stand behind her chair. "The one about Coyote and the stars." Eleanor smiled slightly. "I'm still not sure I captured the part about the Pleiades correctly." Narco leaned closer, his presence a warmth at her shoulder. "7 sisters," he corrected, pointing to a phrase, "not 6, important difference." 7 sisters, she repeated, making the correction. Their collaboration had developed its own intimacy, his stories flowing through her pen, his knowledge preserved by her hand. Later, as darkness fell early and complete, they sat before the fire, drinking tea. Narco worked at something in his hands, a length of sinew threaded with blue and white trade beads. His fingers moved with the same precision he brought to everything, weaving patterns almost too small to see. "What are you making?" Eleanor asked, watching the firelight play across his concentrated features. "Bracelet." He held up the partially completed band. "Traditional design from my mother's people." Eleanor studied the intricate pattern. "It's beautiful. I didn't know you had such things with you." "Found beads in old jar on top shelf." He glanced at her. "Hope you don't mind. Can replace them." "No, I don't mind." The beads had belonged to her mother, purchased from a traveling peddler and never used. "Who is it for?" Narco's hand stilled momentarily. "For you, if you want it." The simple statement caught Eleanor unprepared. A gift, not out of necessity or practicality, but simply as an offering. "Why?" she asked, her voice softer than intended. He considered the question with his usual care. "Because hands should make beautiful things, not just useful ones." A pause. "And because you listen to stories no one else wanted to hear." Eleanor felt warmth rise to her cheeks, unfamiliar and almost forgotten. "I would be honored to wear it." They fell silent, the moment fragile between them. The storm beyond the walls retreated from awareness, irrelevant to this small circle of warmth and unexpected connection. "Tell me about your tribe," Eleanor said eventually. "Not just the stories, but your life there." Naker's expression shifted, growing distant. "Was good life before soldiers came, before diseases." His fingers resumed their work with the beads. "My father respected. My mother, beautiful. Had sister, younger." "What happened to them?" Eleanor asked gently. "Fever took father and sister same winter." His voice remained steady, but his eyes reflected old pain. "Mother, still with tribe. Chose tribal elder for new husband. No place for son who questioned old ways." "You questioned them. Said we should learn white man's knowledge. Use it to survive." His mouth tightened. "Elders said I betrayed our traditions. White world said I could never belong." His hands completed another section of the bracelet. "Both right, perhaps. Or both wrong," Eleanor countered. "Belonging isn't something others grant you. It's something you claim." Narco looked up, studying her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see beyond surface. "Is that what you do here, claim belonging?" The question pierced more deeply than Eleanor expected. "I stopped trying to belong anywhere long ago. Maybe mistake for both of us," he said quietly. Outside, the wind moaned like a living thing, seeking entrance. Inside, something equally powerful but gentler shifted between two souls accustomed to existing at the margins of the world. Eleanor had wheeled herself to the chest at the foot of her bed during his absence, a task she had been contemplating for days. When Narco returned, he found her surrounded by objects she hadn't examined in years. Books, letters, and a silver-framed daguerreotype that now sat on her lap. "Spring cleaning?" he asked, setting the rabbits aside for later preparation. "More like excavating the past," Eleanor replied, her fingers tracing the image under glass. These were my parents. Nako approached, studying the formal portrait of a distinguished couple, the woman seated rigidly in a high-backed chair, the man standing behind with a proprietary hand on her shoulder. "Your father looks stern," he observed. Eleanor smiled faintly. He was Judge Finch of Boston. His word was law in court and at home. She tapped the glass over her mother's image. She was gentler, but equally convinced of certain truths. What truths? That a woman's purpose was to marry well and maintain social position. That education for daughters was primarily to make them suitable companions for educated husbands. Eleanor's voice took on a distant quality. I disappointed them by becoming a teacher instead of a suitable wife, then doubly disappointed by moving west. Why did you come west? Nako settled on the floor near her chair, his interest evident. Eleanor hadn't spoken of these things in years, yet found herself willing to share with this man who listened without judgment. Suffocation. Boston was all constraints, the right words, the right dress, the right opinions. After my parents died, there was nothing to keep me there. She set the portrait aside, retrieving a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. I answered an advertisement for a school teacher in Wyoming Territory, arrived with ridiculous notions about frontier life gleaned from dime novels. And the reality? Dust, hardship and isolation. She smiled wryly. But also freedom. For the first time, I was valued for my mind rather than my family name or marriageability. The school board respected me. Parents listened to my opinions about their children's education. You were happy, Nako observed. Yes, the simple word carried the weight of loss. I was. Then the accident. Eleanor nodded, her hands unconsciously moving to her useless legs. A routine journey to Laramie for educational supplies. The stagecoach was overcrowded. I was seated over the wheel that broke. Her voice grew quieter. I remember falling, a terrible sideways lurch, then nothing until I woke in Doc Miller's house with people speaking about me as if I weren't there. Such a shame, they said. What will become of her now? Nako's expression remained steady, giving her space to continue. Frederick Holloway was courting me then. He taught mathematics and natural philosophy at the school. Eleanor's fingers worked at the ribbon binding the letters. He'd proposed the week before. When he visited me after the accident, he couldn't look at my legs, couldn't look at me at all. She untied the ribbon, revealing a short stack of correspondence. He wrote instead of speaking to my face, said he wasn't equipped for such a burden, that I deserved someone who could provide proper care. He feared, Nako said simply. Yes, everyone did. The school board expressed regret, but found a replacement within a week. Friends visited less frequently, then not at all. This cabin belonged to my predecessor. I'd purchased it as an investment. It became my refuge instead, my prison. Eleanor looked up, meeting Nako's steady gaze. I withdrew before they could reject me outright, became a ghost in my own life. And the writing, my secret rebellion. Stories where women weren't defined by their body's limitations, where value came from character rather than usefulness. Her mouth twisted. Childish fantasies. Not childish, Nako countered. Necessary. Like my people's stories, they keep truth alive when world denies it. Eleanor considered this perspective, perhaps, but I stopped believing in them. When did you stop fighting? The question held no accusation, only genuine curiosity. The directness of his inquiry caught her off guard, when indeed, not immediately after the accident, not even after Frederick's abandonment. It had been a gradual surrender, a slow erosion of resistance against the town's perception of her as an object of pity. I don't know, she admitted. It happened so gradually I hardly noticed. But you fought sheriff, Nako reminded her. Defended me. Defended yourself. Eleanor met his gaze, something shifting in her understanding of herself. I did, didn't I? Fighter still lives, he said simply. Just sleeping. He rose to prepare the rabbits, leaving Eleanor with her memories and the startling realization that perhaps she wasn't as resigned to her fate as she had believed. Perhaps something had merely been dormant, waiting for the right moment or the right presence to awaken. Nako's blankets lay empty by the stove. Eleanor found him slumped against the woodpile, firewood scattered at his feet, his skin burned with fever, eyes glassy and unfocused. Nako? Alarm sharpened her voice. What happened? Trapline, he mumbled, words slurring together. River broke, fell through. With difficulty, Eleanor helped him to her bed, the only practical option. His sodden clothes revealed an angry gash along his ribs, presumably from ice during his fall. The wound had begun to fester, angry red streaks extending outward. "Why didn't you say something?" she demanded, fear making her tone harsh as she gathered clean cloths and water. "Not serious," he insisted, though his shivering belied the claim. "Just need rest. This is infection, not tiredness." Eleanor wrung a cloth in hot water. "Where are your medicines?" He gestured weakly toward his bundle of possessions. Small pouch, green powder, yellow root. Eleanor rummaged through his belongings, finding the items along with something unexpected. A small drum, its buffalo hide surface cracked with age, decorated with faded symbols in red and black pigment. She returned with the medicinal pouch, setting the drum aside carefully. "How do I prepare these?" Through fevered instructions, Nako guided her through creating a poultice for the wound and a bitter tea for the infection. His teachings from previous weeks now served them both, as Eleanor followed his directions with determined precision. As night fell, his fever worsened. Eleanor maintained her vigil, replacing cooling cloths on his forehead, reapplying the poultice, coaxing sips of medicinal tea between his cracked lips. His skin burned beneath her fingers, his breathing growing labored. Near midnight, he began speaking in his native tongue, words Eleanor couldn't understand flowing in an urgent stream. His hands moved restlessly, reaching for something unseen. "Nako," she called, trying to anchor him. "Nako, stay with me." His eyes opened, but didn't see her. He murmured. "Naman, ah." Eleanor took his hand, alarmed by its heat. "It's Eleanor, you're safe," he continued in Apache, growing increasingly agitated. Desperate to calm him, Eleanor reached for the drum she had discovered, placing it where he could see it. The effect was immediate. Toko's focus sharpened, his hand reaching for the instrument. "My father's," he whispered in English. "Sacred drum." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, placing it gently in his hands. "It's here. You're safe." His fingers traced the symbols on the drum's surface, for healing ceremonies, for calling spirits. His eyes met hers with surprising clarity. "Not supposed to have it," elders said. "I betrayed traditions. No right to carry sacred things. But you kept it anyway," Eleanor observed. "Last piece of father, of home." His voice faded as fever reclaimed him. Throughout the night, Eleanor fought for him as he had once fought winter, to reach her door. She sang softly, songs from her own childhood, when his restlessness grew pronounced. She spoke to him of spring, of stories yet to write, of healing still to come. Whether her words reached him, she couldn't know, but the act of offering them steadied her own resolve. Near dawn, Nako's fever broke in a rush of sweat that soaked the bedding. His breathing eased, his skin cooling beneath Eleanor's vigilant touch. She sagged with relief, exhaustion claiming her as she dozed in her chair beside the bed. She woke to find him watching her, his eyes clear for the first time in days. The drum rested against his chest, one hand curved protectively over its surface. "You saved me," he said simply. Eleanor shook her head. "Your medicines did the work. I just followed instructions. Not just medicine." His gaze held hers. "You called me back." The quiet certainty in his voice raised a flush to her cheeks. "I spoke nonsense to keep you quiet." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Not nonsense, truth." His fingers brushed the drum surface. "I heard." Eleanor busied herself gathering the soiled cloths. Unused to such direct acknowledgement. "You should rest more. An infection could return." "Eleanor." The sound of her name stopped her movement. "Thank you." The simple words contained multitudes. Gratitude, yes, but something deeper. Recognition of care freely given, of boundaries crossed for another's sake. "You would have done the same," she said, certain of this truth. "Yes." He touched the beaded bracelet he had made, now circling her wrist. "We are no longer strangers." The observation settled between them, profound in its simplicity. They had moved beyond necessity, beyond practical arrangement. into something neither had expected to find in this remote cabin: genuine concern for another's welfare. Perhaps even friendship. No, Eleanor agreed softly. We are not strangers anymore. I've been thinking, Narco said, one morning as he watched Eleanor struggle to chop vegetables, her position in the wheelchair making the task awkward and potentially dangerous. Your kitchen tools fight against you. Eleanor glanced up, a strand of auburn hair falling across her forehead. Most things in the world weren't designed with sitting women in mind. Could be different, he replied, the thoughtful expression she'd come to recognize settling on his features. May I? At her nod, he took measurements of her chair height, arm length and the counter edge, making notes with a stub of pencil on a scrap of paper. For the next 2 days, he worked in the woodshed, the sound of sawing and sanding drifting through the cabin walls. When he finally presented his creation, Eleanor stared in silent amazement. A wooden board, with a clever slant, secured to the counter edge with iron hooks, bringing the work surface perfectly level with her seated position. Leather straps held items securely in place while cutting. Try, he encouraged, positioning it before her. Eleanor placed an onion on the board, finding she could slice it without the usual strain on her shoulders and back. The knife moved smoothly across the angled surface, the vegetable held steady by the straps. Words failed her momentarily. This changes everything. Narco's expression remained serious, but pleasure flickered in his eyes. First of many. Have ideas for cooking pot holder, water pump extension. You've been planning this, Eleanor realized. While fever had me in bed, watched how you work. Saw ways to make easier. Eleanor tested the board again, marveling at how such a simple adjustment transformed a daily struggle into an effortless task. Not since before her accident had cooking felt like anything but a chore to be endured. Why? She asked, echoing the question she had posed weeks earlier when he first offered to lower her shelves. This time, his answer came more readily. Because you should not fight your home as well as the world. The simple wisdom of his statement struck Eleanor profoundly. For years, she had accepted the daily battles with her environment as inevitable punishment for her condition. The possibility that her surroundings could adapt to her, rather than demanding constant adaptation from her, felt revolution. Over the following days, Narco's creations multiplied: a rack that allowed her to wash dishes without strain, a modified broom with an angled handle, a system of pulleys that enabled her to retrieve items from upper shelves without assistance. Each innovation restored a small measure of independence. Eleanor had surrendered to her limitations. Where did you learn to invent such things? She asked as they shared evening tea, the cabin now transformed by his modifications. Narco's gaze turned inward, to memories. After cavalry bullet shattered my leg, I was like you, angry at things I could not do, made tools to help myself. Tribe thought it strange, said I should accept limitations as creators will, and you disagreed. Yes. His expression grew distant. Said creator gave us minds to solve problems. Elders said I had white man's thinking. The familiar pain of rejection shadowed his features momentarily. Perhaps they were right. Or perhaps you simply refused to be defined by what you couldn't do. Eleanor gestured to the modifications surrounding them. As you've now helped me refuse. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. You were a fighter before I came. Just needed right weapon. They fell silent, contemplating the strange journey that had brought them together. Two people rejected by their respective worlds, finding unexpected strength in shared experience. Spring will come soon, Eleanor observed, watching melting icicles drip past the window. The unspoken question hung between them. When the snow retreated completely, when roads cleared and travel became possible again, what then? Would Narco continue his interrupted journey, leaving her with clever tools but new solitude? As if hearing her thoughts, he spoke. Been thinking about garden. Garden? Eleanor repeated, surprised. South side of cabin gets good sun, soil looks rich. He met her gaze directly. Could plant vegetables, medicinal herbs, if you want. The proposition was about more than plants. It was about seasons, about remaining. That would be practical, Eleanor said carefully, afraid to presume too much. Yes, practical. Nako nodded, something warming in his usually guarded expression. And good, to grow things. Together. The simple word together expanded in the space between them, filled with possibilities neither had dared consider when winter first threw them into reluctant companionship. Yes, Eleanor agreed softly. Together. Outside, the first robin of spring sang its return, harbinger of renewal and growth to come. The familiar jangle of harness bells announced Mrs. Palmer's arrival for the long-delayed supply delivery. Eleanor met her at the door, conscious of Nako's deliberate retreat to the woodshed, an unspoken strategy they had agreed upon without discussion. Eleanor, dear. Mrs. Palmer's forced brightness barely masked her curiosity as her gaze swept the cabin interior. We've been so worried. Sheriff Miller said you had company. Good morning, Mrs. Palmer. Eleanor replied evenly. Yes, I've had assistance this winter. The supplies, please. Mrs. Palmer set the basket on the table, still scanning for evidence of Nako's presence. Dr. Miller sent laudanum, said your condition might be causing increased discomfort with the weather changes. Please thank him, though it's unnecessary. Eleanor counted out payment from her dwindling funds. I've found other remedies more effective. Indian remedies, I suppose. The words carried unmistakable disapproval. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. Yes, quite effective and without the clouded thinking laudanum brings. Mrs. Palmer's lips thinned. The whole town is talking, Eleanor. A respectable woman. Alone with an Indian man. The Reverend is most concerned for your moral welfare. How kind of everyone to suddenly remember I exist, Eleanor observed dryly, after 6 years of near-complete neglect. Now, that's unfair. We've always brought supplies and left as quickly as possible. Eleanor finished. Tell me, Mrs. Palmer, in 6 years, how many times have you stayed for tea? Asked how I was managing, offered genuine assistance rather than pity. The older woman flushed. That's not, we didn't. Exactly. Eleanor began unpacking the supplies, signaling the conversation's end. Please add coffee to next month's delivery, and writing paper. Mrs. Palmer gathered herself, clearly flustered by Eleanor's directness. There's talk of a town meeting. About your situation. My situation is none of the town's concern. When it involves harboring a potentially dangerous. He has a name, Eleanor interrupted, anger flaring. Nako. And he has shown more humanity than Cottonwood Springs managed in 6 years. Mrs. Palmer retreated a step, clutching her reticule. I can see you're quite decided, but you should know people are talking. The Gazette even mentioned concerns. She extracted a folded newspaper from her bag, placing it on the table with exaggerated care. You might want to prepare yourself for further intervention, for your own good, of course. After Miss Palmer's departure, Nako emerged from the woodshed, his expression carefully neutral. Went well. Eleanor snorted inelegantly. Splendidly. We've become the town's favorite topic of gossip. She unfolded the newspaper, finding the small item on the second page. Concerns have been raised regarding the welfare of Miss Eleanor Finch, who resides alone despite her unfortunate condition. Reports of an unusual houseguest of Indian extraction have prompted Sheriff Miller to consider appropriate intervention. Appropriate intervention, Eleanor read aloud, voice tight with anger, as if I were a child incapable of making decisions. Nako studied the paper, his face betraying nothing. Expected this? Yes. Well, I expected better from people who claim Christian charity. Eleanor crumpled the paper. Though I don't know why, given past experience. He sat across from her, hands resting on the table. Should I leave would be easier for you? Easier? Eleanor looked up sharply. To return to struggling alone. To lose. She stopped, emotions threatening to overwhelm practicality. To lose what? He prompted gently. The first real companionship I've known in years, she admitted. The first person who sees me as Eleanor, not as a tragic invalid to be pitied from a distance. Something softened in Nako's expression, could go temporarily. Return when talk dies down. And if it doesn't, If they send someone to look after me properly, the possibility struck Eleanor with fresh horror. I'd rather face the town's disapproval than return to being treated like a helpless child. Not helpless, Nako agreed. Never that. They sat in silence, the newspaper between them like a declaration of war from Cottonwood Springs. We need a strategy, Eleanor said finally. The town will only escalate their concern if we ignore them. Nako nodded, thinking, could go to town together. Show you are well, making choices freely. The suggestion startled her. In 6 years she had avoided Cottonwood Springs entirely, unwilling to navigate its unpaved streets in her wheelchair or face the awkward pity of former friends. I haven't been to town since the accident, she admitted. Perhaps time to return, on your terms. His steady gaze held confidence in her that Eleanor hardly recognized in herself. Show them the fighter I see. Eleanor considered the prospect, anxiety warring with a growing sense of determination. The woman who had confronted Sheriff Miller at her door was not the same woman who had hidden away for 6 years. Something had changed or reawakened during the winter months. Yes, she decided, straightening in her chair. It's time they saw me, the real me, not their convenient illusion. Nako's rare smile appeared briefly. We'll build better wheels for chair first. Mud is deep. Their eyes met in shared resolve. The town had drawn a line. Together they would cross it. The night before their planned departure, a spring storm descended, postponing their journey. Wind rattled the windows as they sat before the fire, the forced delay creating space for conversations too long deferred. May I ask something personal? Eleanor ventured, watching firelight play across Nako's features. He nodded, his hands continuing their work on a leather strap for her chair. You've never spoken of a wife. Was there someone before? She left the question unfinished, uncertain of her right to ask. Nako's hands stilled. There was. Morning Flower. His voice softened on the name. Arranged match. Good family. Beautiful. What happened? Cavalry attack on our winter camp. Many died. His expression remained controlled, but pain shadowed his eyes. She survived. I was away hunting. When I returned, tribal elders had moved survivors to new territory. Did you follow? Tried. Found them 6 months later, the leather strap twisted in his grip. She had new husband, by then, elder's son. Better match, they said. Man who respected old ways. Eleanor absorbed this new knowledge of loss. I'm sorry, Nako shrugged, the gesture belying the evident weight of the memory. Long ago now. Does it still hurt? The question was as much for herself as for him. He considered thoughtfully, like old brake that aches before storm. Not sharp pain anymore. Eleanor nodded, understanding the analogy perfectly. I started writing a letter to Frederick today. My former fiancé. Nako looked up, curious. I never expected to send it, she clarified. Just needed to find words for things I've carried too long. She retrieved an unfinished page from her desk. I thought I needed to forgive him for abandoning me when I needed him most. And now? Now I realize I don't need to forgive him. I need to thank him. At Nako's surprised expression, she explained, if he had stayed, married me out of duty or pity, I would have become someone I'm not. Someone grateful for scraps of attention, someone apologizing for my existence. Nako nodded slowly, understanding, better alone than wrongly matched. Yes, though I wasn't really living, just existing. Eleanor set the unfinished letter aside. Until you arrived, the simple acknowledgement hung in the air between them, more revealing than she had intended. Nako met her gaze steadily. You changed me too. How? She asked softly. Made me believe belonging possible again. His voice remained even, but emotion underscored the words. After tribe rejected me, after whites drove me away, thought I would always be outside, watching others live. The parallel to her own experience struck Eleanor forcefully. They had both been observers of life rather than participants. She confined by her disability and the town's perceptions, he by the prejudice that made him unwelcome everywhere. And now she asked, Now I think perhaps two outsiders can create place of belonging. His eyes held hers, the directness of his gaze conveying what words alone could not. If they choose, Eleanor's heart quickened. Is that what you want? To belong here? With you, he clarified simply. Place matters less than person. The honesty of his declaration demanded equal honesty in return. Eleanor gathered her courage. When you first arrived, I thought the greatest gift was having practical help. Then I thought it was having conversation after years of silence. She touched the beaded bracelet he had made her, now a permanent fixture on her wrist. I was wrong. The greatest gift was being seen, really seen, not as a burden or a tragedy or a problem to be solved. Just as Eleanor, as you are, Nako agreed. And I see you too, she continued, words flowing more freely now. Not as the town sees you or as your tribe did, just as Nako, the man who rebuilds what's broken, who carries healing in his hands. Something shifted in his expression, a softening of vulnerability rarely permitted. What are we saying, Eleanor? The directness of his question demanded equal directness in response. That I care for you, in ways I never expected to feel again, in ways that frighten me. Why frightening? Because I've lost everyone who mattered, because the town will never accept us, because I don't know if I can bear watching you leave when you realize how limited a life with me would be. Nako moved to kneel beside her chair, bringing their faces level, not limited, different. His hand hovered near hers, not quite touching. Choose what we build, not what others say possible. Eleanor bridged the distance between their hands, her fingers entwining with his. Is this really possible? Instead of answering directly, he said, when winter came, thought I would die alone in snow, found you instead. After that, everything possible. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but within the cabin, something weathered and worn had finally found its proper name. They arrived mid-morning, Sheriff Miller, Reverend Simmons, Dr. Miller, and Mr. Holloway, the bank manager, an official delegation, faces set with the self-righteous determination of those convinced they know what's best for others. Nako spotted them first, from the newly tilled garden plot. They come, he said, straightening to his full height, shovel in hand. Eleanor positioned her chair in the doorway, a queen defending her realm. Their recent confessions had transformed her posture, her certainty. She would not be intimidated in her own home. Miss Finch, Sheriff Miller began without preamble. We've come to discuss your situation. My situation is quite satisfactory, Eleanor replied evenly. But please, state your business. The men exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for her directness. Reverend Simmons stepped forward, Bible predictably in hand. Eleanor, dear, the town council has met regarding your circumstances. His sympathetic tone set her teeth on edge. We've come to a decision that serves everyone's best interests. How remarkable that my best interests were determined without consulting me, Eleanor observed. What exactly has been decided? Mr. Holloway cleared his throat. In light of your condition and living arrangement, which many find concerning, we've arranged more suitable accommodations. I have suitable accommodations, Eleanor gestured to her cabin. A room has been prepared at Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house, the Reverend continued, as if she hadn't spoken, with proper nursing assistance. The Christian Ladies' Aid Society has generously agreed to cover expenses. And what of my home? My independence? The men exchanged another glance, this one distinctly uncomfortable. Well, as to that, Mr. Holloway began, the bank has reviewed the property deed and found certain irregularities. Cold anger settled in Eleanor's chest. What irregularities? I purchased this property legally from Mr. Jenkins 6 years ago. Yes, but there's a question of whether a woman in your condition can legally maintain independent property ownership without male guardianship. Mr. Holloway's gaze slid away from hers. Technically, the court could appoint a trustee to manage the property in your best interest. My condition. Eleanor's voice remained dangerously calm. You mean my paralysis or being unmarried? Neither affects my legal standing. Dr. Miller stepped forward. Eleanor, please understand, this is for your own welfare. Living alone out here, especially with unsuitable company, his gaze flicked dismissively toward Nako, raises questions about your mental competence. The pieces suddenly aligned in perfect, ugly clarity. This isn't about my welfare at all, Eleanor said slowly. This is about my land. Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably. Now, Eleanor. The railroad survey, she continued, comprehension dawning. The new line they're planning. It would cross the north corner of my property, wouldn't it? The men's expressions confirmed her suspicion. This coordinated concern had nothing to do with her well-being or moral standing. It was about acquiring her land for the coming railroad, likely with compensation far below its true value. Get off my property, Eleanor stated, her voice quiet but steel-edged. Miss Finch, be reasonable, the sheriff began. I am being extremely reasonable, considering you've come to steal my home under the guise of Christian charity. Eleanor's hands gripped her wheel rims. I have the deed in my desk, properly filed and registered. My ownership is legally binding. A court might see things differently, Mr. Holloway warned, especially given your unusual living arrangement. Nako moved to stand beside Eleanor's chair, his presence solid and unwavering. You threaten a woman who harmed no one, he observed, his calm voice carrying unexpected authority. Take her home because she chooses company you dislike. This doesn't concern you, Indian, the sheriff snapped. Concerns me because concerns her, Nako replied simply. We stand together. Eleanor reached for his hand, taking it openly before the town delegation. Their shocked expressions might have been comical in another context. I believe we ought send each other, she said. You want my land. You'll use my disability and Nako's presence as excuses to take it. And we refuse. Eleanor, the Reverend's voice hardened, dropping all pretense of sympathy. Consider carefully. A woman in your position has few allies. Throwing your lot in with him will only isolate you further. I've been isolated for 6 years while you all pretended I didn't exist, Eleanor replied evenly. Now that my land has value, you suddenly remember me. How convenient. This isn't the end of the matter, Sheriff Miller warned. We'll return with legal papers for your own protection. And we'll be waiting, Eleanor assured him, with legal representation of our own. It was a bluff. She had no lawyer, no resources for a legal battle, but the men couldn't know that. As the delegation departed, casting backward glances filled with disapproval and frustration, Eleanor felt Nako's hand tighten around hers. They will return, he said quietly. Yes. Eleanor watched the men mount their horses, with paperwork and false concern, and probably a doctor ready to declare me incompetent. What will we do? Eleanor looked up at him, the we warming her despite the circumstances. We'll fight. Together. We need information, Eleanor said, wheeling herself to a trunk she hadn't opened in years. And allies, if possible. Nako watched as she extracted a heavy, leather-bound volume. What is that? Wyoming Territorial Law, 1882 edition. She blew dust from the cover. From when I taught civic principles to the older students. Not the most recent, but territorial law changes slowly. They spent the day poring over legal statutes regarding property rights, competency hearings, and guardianship laws. Eleanor's methodical mind, once directed toward teaching, now focused on their legal defense with unwavering determination. Here, she said finally, finger marking a passage. Wyoming territory specifically grants women property rights equal to men. They can't claim my gender invalidates my ownership. What about? Nako hesitated. Your legs? Eleanor flipped pages with practiced efficiency. Physical disability is not grounds for incompetence. They'd need to prove mental incapacity, which requires medical testimony and evidence of inability to manage affairs. The doctor seemed ready to provide that, Nako observed. Dr. Miller may be biased, but he's not a fool. He knows I'm perfectly competent. Eleanor closed the book decisively. They'll try to use our relationship as evidence of poor judgment instead. Their eyes met, the reality of their situation hanging between them. In the eyes of Cottonwood Springs, their greatest strength, their connection, was their greatest vulnerability. Need witness. Narco said thoughtfully, someone from town who will speak for you. Who would dare? Eleanor's laugh held no humor. I've been forgotten for 6 years. Not by everyone, perhaps. Narco rose, pacing the small cabin. We'll go to town tomorrow. Listen, watch. Eleanor looked up sharply. Alone? That's dangerous. Not first time in hostile territory. His mouth quirked in a half-smile. Won't be seen. The next morning, Narco departed before dawn. Eleanor spent the day in anxious productivity, copying relevant legal passages onto separate sheets, organizing their defense. The sound of approaching hoofbeats near dusk sent her heart racing, but it was Narco who appeared in the doorway, his expression more animated than usual. Found something, he said, removing his hat. Railroad plans posted in bank window. Your land not only peace needed, Jenkins' farm too, and Widow Morton's place. Martha Morton? Eleanor's brow furrowed. Her husband died in the mine collapse 2 years ago. She's been struggling to keep the farm going alone. She refused to sell, Narco continued. Overheard bank manager talking, said they'd find way to force her out too. Eleanor absorbed this information, mind working rapidly. So we're not the only ones they're targeting. Martha might be an ally. More. Narco's eyes held a rare gleam. Found someone else. The teacher who replaced you, Miss Abernathy. Caroline? She's still there. Visited general store. Heard her defending you to other women. Narco related the overheard conversation. Said town treated you shamefully. Said if you found companionship, they should rejoice instead of condemn. Hope flickered to life in Eleanor's chest. Caroline was always independent-minded, too much so for Reverend Simmons' taste, and the storekeeper, Mr. Chen. Narco added another unexpected name to their potential allies. He said nothing, but when others left, told Miss Abernathy he would stand with her if she spoke for you. Eleanor's eyes widened. Li Shen. He hardly speaks to anyone. Said his people know about exclusion. Said treatment of you and me. Not American way. A plan began forming in Eleanor's mind, not just defense, but counterattack. We need to get messages to them, and to Martha Morton. Already done. Narco's rare smile appeared. Miss Abernathy will visit tomorrow, said to prepare for a proper tea lesson. Eleanor stared at him in amazement. You arranged all this in one day? People talk freely around someone they think doesn't matter. His expression held no bitterness, only tactical satisfaction. Their mistake. The next afternoon brought the most peculiar tea party Eleanor's cabin had ever hosted. Caroline Abernathy arrived in her prim schoolteacher's dress, followed by Martha Morton in widow's black, and to Eleanor's astonishment, Li Chen in his carefully pressed shirt and vest. Caroline embraced Eleanor without hesitation. 6 years too long, she said simply. I should have come sooner. Martha's weathered face showed recognition of a kindred spirit. Heard they're trying to take your land same as mine. Figured we might stand stronger together. Miss Chen bowed slightly. Railroad men think we are easy to push aside. Women, foreigners. His English was precise, his determination unmistakable. They are mistaken. Around Eleanor's table, an unlikely alliance formed. Caroline's knowledge of town politics, Martha's fierce independence, Miss Chen's careful documentation of the bank's questionable practices, and Eleanor's legal research combined with Narco's strategic thinking created a formidable defense. They expect to find you isolated and vulnerable, Caroline said as they finalized their plan. Their risk will be our advantage. As their visitors departed, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The strength of community, of belonging to something larger than her own struggles. We are not alone anymore, Narco observed quietly, standing beside her chair as they watched their allies depart. Eleanor reached for his hand. No, neither of us is alone now. Sheriff Miller's expression shifted from confidence to weariness as he took in the assembled group. Eleanor at the center in her wheelchair, Nako standing steadfast beside her. Caroline Abernathy in her prim, authoritative schoolteacher posture. Martha Morton with her weathered farmer's determination. Li Chen, straight-backed and observant. And most surprisingly, Judge Peterson, recently arrived from the Territorial Circuit Court, whom Caroline had taught alongside years ago. "This seems an unnecessary show of force, Miss Finch," the sheriff observed, tipping his hat awkwardly. "Not force, Sheriff. Community." Eleanor's voice carried the strength of someone who had rediscovered her place in the world. "I believe you've come with legal papers." Mr. Holloway stepped forward, documents in hand. "A simple matter of guardianship, given your condition and situation." Judge Peterson extended his hand. "I'll examine those, if you please." The banker hesitated, then surrendered the papers with obvious reluctance. The judge reviewed them, his bushy eyebrows rising steadily. "Interesting," he murmured. "A petition for competency hearing based on what exactly?" "Physical disability is not grounds for incompetency under territorial law. There are concerns about Miss Finch's judgment," Reverend Simmons interjected. "Her living arrangement with an Indian man raises serious moral questions." "Does it?" Judge Peterson peered at him over his spectacles. "I see two individuals sharing a residence during harsh winter conditions, one with medical knowledge that has apparently improved Miss Finch's health, according to Miss Abernathy's account." "Judge Peterson," Mr. Holloway began, "surely you understand our concern about the railroad's development. This property—" "Ah, yes, the railroad." The judge nodded. "Curious how your concern for Miss Finch's welfare coincides precisely with the railroad's interest in her land, and Mrs. Morton's, and several other properties whose owners might be considered vulnerable." Eleanor wheeled forward slightly. "We have documented every conversation where bank officials or town council members discussed using competency hearings or moral judgments to force land sales below market value." Li Chen nodded. "Many discussions in my store. People forget I understand English when they speak over my head." "That's hearsay," the sheriff protested. "Hardly evidence." Perhaps Judge Peterson agreed, but sufficient to warrant investigation before any competency hearing could proceed. He folded the papers deliberately, and as the circuit judge who would hear such a case, I find myself disinclined to entertain it at all. The delegation's faces registered the slow realization that their carefully constructed plan was collapsing. "The territorial governor might be interested to learn how certain officials have approached this railroad matter," the judge continued mildly, "particularly given Wyoming's progressive stance on women's property rights." The implied threat hung in the air. Careers and reputations could be ruined by such an investigation. Dr. Miller, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we've been overzealous in our concern. Miss Finch appears to be managing quite well." "Indeed." Eleanor's smile held no warmth. "My condition hasn't changed in 6 years, Doctor. Only your perception of it when my land became valuable." Silence fell as the town officials exchanged uncomfortable glances, their position increasingly untenable. "I suggest a compromise," Eleanor said finally. "The railroad can petition for a right-of-way across the northern corner of my property, at fair market value, properly assessed by an independent party." "And Mrs. Morton's land?" Caroline prompted. "The same terms, fair negotiation with all affected property owners." Eleanor's gaze swept the officials. "No threats, no manipulations, no using physical disability or unconventional relationships as weapons." The delegation withdrew shortly after, their defeat palpable in stiff shoulders and tight expression. As hoofbeats faded, the unlikely alliance on Eleanor's porch exchanged glances that transformed into smiles, then laughter, the release of tension and the sweet taste of victory. One by one, their allies departed with promises to return soon, leaving Eleanor and Nako alone in the gentle evening light. "We did it," Eleanor said softly, still hardly believing. "You did it," Nako corrected. his pride evident. "Found your voice again. We found it together." She gazed across the land that remained theirs, the newly tilled garden plot, the repaired cabin, the future they had begun to envision. "What happens now?" Nako knelt beside her chair, reaching for the packets of seeds they had arranged on the windowsill that morning, a quiet act of faith before the confrontation. "Now we plant corn, beans, medicinal herbs, things that grow together." The symbolism wasn't lost on Eleanor. "Like us, growing despite everything, because of everything," he amended, stronger for the struggle. As sunset painted the Wyoming sky in impossible colors, they moved toward the garden plot, seeds in hand. Two people the world had rejected, creating their own belonging, writing their own story, word by word, seed by seed. "Tomorrow," Eleanor said, "I'll begin writing again, our story, so others might understand." Nako nodded, understanding the importance of testimony, of witnessing. "Good stories never truly end," he said, echoing the beginning of many tribal tales. "They just plant seeds for new ones to begin." And so they did, together.